Another edition of 100% Canucks. The team is continuing on this another marathon road trip. Loss in Detroit on Thursday night, Saturday night, hockey night in Canada, the Toronto Maple Leafs. But we would take a little bit of a detour, Landon. We've had John Shorthouse on, we've had Jim Robson on, and so we're going to bridge the gap between Robson and Shorthouse and spend some time with Jim Hughson, who has been such an important part in my mind of the success of the Canucks on radio and a continuation of what I describe as the Vancouver style of play-by-play guys. Robson, Hughson, Shorthouse, even Brendan Batchelor on the radio side. There is a common theme that there is something that makes them sound alike.
Yeah, it's something with the cadence for sure. It is interesting though, like they all have a piece of each other in there, or I guess the way they all have a piece of Robson because they all kind of descend off of that. But Jim Hughson is someone I moved to Vancouver in 2002. That was kind of at the height of him calling games for the next number of years. And, being 10 years old all the way up to when I was, 15 or so, or older than that, his voice was part of basically every important hockey game that I watched.
Well, hold on. And now our producer, Hugh McClarty, also reminded us that he was the voice of EA Sports. So there was a little bit of there. So even if you didn't watch the Canucks, you got your fill of Jim Hughson.
Yeah, to be honest, I was playing junior hockey through some of that, and basically anytime the TV was on in my house, like in the basement that I lived in, it either had Jim Hughson's voice on a live hockey game or his voice on the video hockey game, right? So again, and I'm not unlike a lot of people, especially guys my age, he's kind of the soundtrack of a lot of important years and important memories. You look back on the totality of his career, it's pretty amazing the different venues and events he got to call and the longevity of it.
A little boy from northern British Columbia. Made an impact nationally, obviously, but we'll talk more about his impact as a voice on television and on radio of the Vancouver Canucks. That's Landon. I'm John. This is another edition of 100% Canucks.
I won't keep you long. Darren Millard with a tip for everyone who loves great hockey podcasts like this one. John Shannon and I host the OG of 100% Hockey, coming your way multiple times a week. The guest list is the best you will find. Multiple shows a week ensures you won't miss out on any news, and we dig even deeper into the biggest stories around the NHL. Most of our guests are also friends, so I promise there'll be more conversation beyond the X's and the O's. John really does get bored with that after a while. So join us for 100% Hockey. The name says it all. Subscribe now while you enjoy thinking about it. And enjoy.
Welcome back to 100% Canucks. Really thrilled to be joined by one of the former voices of the Canucks on radio and on television, Jim Hughson, who is now, I guess, enjoying life more than anything, right, Jim?
Yeah, I never have a day that's not busy. And, life is good here on the West Coast. So I still love watching the games, and I watch the Canucks pretty closely more than any other team because I live on the West Coast. But these days, when the games are bad, I get to turn them off, and I don't have to travel anywhere to watch them.
No. So when was you remember your first play-by-play Canucks game, radio or TV? It must have been radio, right?
1979. Actually, it's a funny story about this because I thought it was a game in November of 1979 at the Montreal Forum. And I don't keep all my notebooks and things like that. And one's full, toss it away and bring in another one. So I was under the impression that it was 1979 at the Montreal Forum. And our statsman at Hockey Night, Jason Murdoch, went and got, dug through and got somebody to dig through all the files and found me the original game sheet. And in those days, the original game sheets were all handwritten. It was a really cool thing to have. So then one day, shortly after that, I was having a conversation with Jim Robson, who had been my predecessor and who I was filling in for on those nights. My first job in hockey at the NHL level was to do games on radio when Robson was on Hockey Night in Canada. So they were all Saturdays. So I was talking to Jim about it and mentioned that I got this game sheet and how cool I thought it was. And he said, "No, that wasn't the game. I did that game." and this is so typical of Jim. Then he was right back to me very shortly thereafter and named the game. It was a year later in 1980. Same arena. It was in Montreal, and it was actually, I think it was the same score. But yeah, so that was the start of it, and that was the start of a great relationship with Jim Robson too.
So did Jason Murdoch get you a new score sheet?
He did, actually. So now I have two of them.
I couldn't believe like Jim Robson's memory and like how he just could recall names and stories and places and times when we talked to him in the summertime on this show. And, you know, when we brought up your name, you know, he spoke pretty proudly of the career that you ended up having and all of that. Like what was that relationship like for you?
It was really friendly. Like Jim was a mentor without being a classroom teacher, you know. He helped give me access. He helped me move around the league when I didn't know the league. He helped me I still, to this day, if I was doing a game, I use the same notebook setup that Robson used all through his career because he allowed me to look in over his shoulder when he was doing games and I was learning to do games at the NHL level and needed somebody to look in on it. He just opened the door for me to do that. And then, you know, we were apart for a long time and then I took over from him for quite some time. But through it all, and to this very day, I was in touch with him this morning on email. To this very day, we're just good friends. And you are absolutely right about Jim's recall. And still now in his 90s, it's fabulous to sit down and have breakfast with him and a coffee and just listen to the stories he can tell because he remembers absolutely everything.
I feel like that.
Oh, so I was just saves his legal pets. He saves those, Jim. He didn't throw them away like you did.
He kept them all, and he could look back. Some of the things he could just remember off the top of his head, but sometimes, if he needed to, he could look back in his files and in his notebooks and tell you exactly what happened in a particular game on a particular night. It's amazing, really.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I feel like that or like the coffee and a pastry would turn to a brunch pretty quick with him telling stories.
On the table, there's usually 4 or 5 people, but Jim usually leads the way in telling the stories. And you're right, you have to be in a very forgiving place because you take their tables for most of the morning, and you feel like I always feel like I want to just order lunch and stay for a while longer.
And Jim, when you started, what were the players like to be around? Who made an impact on you? And by the way, I must admit, I can see the Roger Nielsen picture over your right shoulder. Yeah. So I think that kind of gives me an indication.
He clearly made an impression on me in a whole bunch of different ways. I used to call him the goofiest man in the world. And I ended up living on the same street as him after he invited me out to lunch in Peterborough one day. And so I moved out of the city of Toronto and on to Chemong Lake near Peterborough at the end of Centerline Smith, right pretty much next to Roger. So I saw all the things that went on. We traveled together when we could, although he was coaching in different places. But he became such a good friend after 1982 and when he was around there. It was so different then, and I don't want to say it's bad, and I hate being the old guy who says it was better in the old days. But when I went down to Canucks practice or after games, I would wander into the dressing room on my own. There weren't many guys around, and just sit down and BS with guys, and there was everybody from Doug Hallward to Richard Brodeur, Harry Snaps, Mark Crawford was there for a little while. And, you know, it was, you had the ability in those days. There was only one PR guy and there were very few media people. So you could sit down and have a chat with somebody about anything. And if they trusted you, they knew it wasn't going anywhere. You knew it wouldn't go anywhere. So you could, you know, pick and choose, and you had to be trustworthy. So you had to be able to disseminate information and know what things were intended to be used and what things you shouldn't. And so it was a fun time in that regard. And you could, you know, sit down and do an interview with somebody, and then there was never a PR guy hanging over your shoulder, and there was never somebody that was looking for content for their own podcast or whatever that was hanging around trying to find out what you were asking because they didn't know what to ask. So it was in that regard, it was very different. But and Steamer was there, Stan Smeal, a lot of great guys who are still pretty good friends of mine. I hang out. I go to a lot of events with the Vancouver Canucks alumni, and it's a wonderful opportunity. Only, you know, a couple of times a year to see all of those players from back in the early 80s, because most of them stayed out here, are still around, and great guys to visit with and talk to.
You know, I love that you brought that up, because that was going to be one of my questions was, you know, how different it is from now to then, but also from the time that you started till the time that you retired. Like, was it the same for the most part, or did you have, you know, kind of the steps of the walls being put up a little bit coming in?
Landon, it was very gradual over a period of time, and it was what it was less and less access. And the guys didn't change very much until I don't know, the last number of years, where it used to be that everybody was available, you know, and because you were allowed in the dressing room and they couldn't, there was very few places for them to hide. And most of the guys didn't care. And that gradually started to change. And so I had some great relationships with a lot of the players, not only in the Canucks, but around the league that I'd followed for years and years. And then it's just started to change. The walls came up. And if you didn't want to speak on a particular day, you didn't have to speak. And even some of the best players were not made available after a while. And it sort of became a useless waste of time to go over to a morning skate, because you just talked to all the media guys from the other team because there was nobody else around. So yeah, that was a huge change, and I really miss that, because I was not an insider. I wasn't looking for anybody to tell me very much. But one of the things I always loved to do is first of all, if it had been a controversial game of any sort, I always thought it was important to be available. If somebody got mad at you and wanted to take you to task on something, well, be there and take it and discuss it. And that's what was always fine. But the other thing was, you watch so many games and you think you understand exactly what happened, and you have a theory about, how a particular play came undone or worked. And I always thought it was nice to be able to go into the dressing room or go down near the dressing room if you could find the guys and have a short discussion about, was I right? What happened here? Here's what I think happened. You tell me. And sometimes you're right, sometimes you weren't, or sometimes there was a different explanation. But even that dried up after a while.
And you know what I found interesting? I'm fresh starting out. You two have a couple of years of experience on me. But one of the things I really enjoy about going down and talking with guys is, sometimes they'll be able to tell you something that's going on in their life or something that's popped up, and it gives you some context to, maybe they've been off for the past couple of games, and it's not like you're going to use that information, but it does help you form how you're going to talk about that player. Without
question. And Landon, even before the NHL went to upper and lower body and stopped disclosing injuries, you could always go to a coach. Sometimes you could go to a trainer. Sometimes you could go right to the player himself and say, you're a bit off. You're not playing the way you usually do. Are you hurt? And, you get a nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and a point to the knee, or, guys saying, I hurt my elbow and I can't shoot, but I'm still playing. And so you're absolutely right. It would form what you said. And so instead of ripping a guy to pieces for having a couple of lousy games, you understand that he's playing through something, and the audience doesn't have to know that, but it really helps. It really used to help anyway, in forming what you would say about a particular player if you knew that he was going through something and maybe should have been out of the lineup, but, continued to play through it.
Did you have a favorite coach?
Other
than Roger, you can't pick Roger because your relationship with Roger, as we all know, is much different than just a broadcaster and a coach. But do you have somebody that you sat back and you always look forward to chatting with at the arena?
Well, especially in the early days, Mark Crawford was fantastic. Alain Vigneault was great. And there again, those were days when, if the game started at 7:00 at Pacific Coliseum or Rogers Arena, General Motors Place, when I was doing a lot of the Canuck games. So games at 7:00, I'd be down there by 5 or so, and I'd just walk into the office and sit down with the coaches. Probably had to record a coach's show at some point, but just BS with guys who know the game so well and talk about different things that were going on. And so Alain Vigneault was great, especially in the early days. And then he had to sort of back off a little bit when they got so good there were too many people around. Keenan was absolutely fabulous. Keenan would tell me things that didn't actually happen. I'm sure of it, because he would use I know he did this. He would use a little radio show that we did before the game in the late 90s, in his short, long tenure here. He would get messages to players through this little radio show. And, and he would say some really things that I hadn't even asked him about, but it would get on the air and somebody would hear it, and he knew that it would get back to the player that he wanted. I remember one story, and that was a really good one, because Al McGillney was a fabulous, fabulous player, and he was, for a lot of the time that he was in Vancouver, he was their best player. He got hurt. Keenan, I don't think, believed that Al was hurt. And so he made his life so miserable with the trainers that he finally got Al to come back in and ask to come back into the lineup. He would work this. He would work little things in on this radio show that we do all the time, and it was only in hindsight that I realized why he was saying all that. He didn't think that McGillney should be out of the lineup, and then when he finally came back in and asked to get back into the lineup, he wouldn't let him in for a couple of days. That's the kind of thing that was going on there. Now, those days from about 1995, when they went into their new building, until things kind of stabilized about 4 years later, I would only describe as complete chaos.
Mm. Yeah. Hey, no, it's funny you mentioned the Coliseum. I'd forgotten you had done so much work there. Did you had a preference? Did you? The new building is glorious, but did you like the Coliseum?
Yeah, it was a very friendly place. It was an old time hockey rink that was just a little bigger than old time hockey rinks, and the concourses were big in the sense that people in the intermissions could go up and you could get together with your friends and have a coffee, have a hot dog, go back in and visit. There were only a couple of levels. It was a really easy place to move around. The broadcast booth seemed so close to the ice compared to whatever's going on now in the NHL, because the buildings are so much bigger, and I understand that they have to be so much higher. They were right on top of it. In my early days, when I only did some of the games, I had to go to all of the home games, and I did interviews in the morning, and I did live to tape interviews after the game that would go onto the post game show. And but during the game, I would go on the catwalk right over center ice and lean over and pretend I was broadcasting the game and do it into the end of my pen so I could practice. And the odd thing about that for me now is that I couldn't even walk across that catwalk now. and I was hanging out there, hanging over the edge, watching the game and pretending I was broadcasting it. And the other thing was about the old Pacific Coliseum and many of the old rinks, once you were in the door, you pretty much had the run of the place. You could go anywhere.
Yeah.
Well,
I loved it.
You'll be happy to know I called one of the Vancouver Golden Eyes game. You know, the women's team is playing out of the Coliseum now, and everything you just described of like it's a gathering place, and like all the intermissions, like that feel is carrying on now with the PWHL. They're doing an awesome job. It was a great atmosphere, but it was cool to see it like that. To me, I wasn't living in Vancouver when the Canucks were playing there, but you know, I got to witness the Memorial Cup, the Giants winning there, and like some big moments of my childhood. Sure. And like it's right back to that. It's really cool to see.
And I'm glad that it's still there. And it's kind of cool that the Golden Eyes are there because it gives them their own home and more of their own identity instead of having to share the building. And you know, the old, I guess the laws and building codes and things were a lot different when they built that place as opposed to when GM Place opened, and the new rinks open everywhere now. Because if you wanted to visit somebody who's 10 sections over, you're going to miss a period trying to get to them. You know? In that place, you just went up to the concourse and met your buddies.
Yeah, or you just walked through the sections.
Yeah, exactly. And you can do it. And the broadcast booth for television in that building was the best in the league.
So where were you set up there?
We were had a section blocked off just below.
It was called the VIP section. It was called the VIP section.
And right below the first or only concourse, and it was just, I don't know how far from the ice it was, John, but it was not very far at all. And boy, you could see everything. Many of the other booths were like that too. Boston at the time, you felt like you were going to get a high stick and you had to move your head back if somebody skated by. There were many of them were like that.
Because they built it like a little kind of cubicle right on the concourse above the first section. So like you're saying, like I've never broadcast a game from that close. It felt like you could hear them. It was much fun.
Yeah, that's great. There's some great memories from there and some great games too.
No. So that was one thing I wanted to talk about. You have the enviable situation where you were around in 82 for the Canucks Islanders Stanley Cup final, 94 Rangers Canucks Stanley Cup final, 2011 Bruins Canucks.
I wasn't around for 94. You
were doing baseball?
No, I came back in 94, but after the playoff.
Okay.
I was working baseball and hockey at TSN in the spring. It's funny too because I was so interested in that Stanley Cup final, and those were the days too that it was really hard if you were in America to find a place to watch the game. And when the game 7 came along, I was in San Diego. No, it couldn't have been San Diego because that was in the National League. Those were the Expos. I was deep into the United States somewhere, and this was a regular occurrence, as you know, John. There was a nightly hunt for a place that had a satellite dish and, number 2, would actually move it to find a hockey game. So you had to get safety in numbers. You had to get a group together, and they knew that they were going to make some money off you and beers and food, and they might switch it to a hockey game. But it wasn't as easy as going to your hotel room. I can't remember in those days any hotel rooms that ever had a hockey game on.
No.
It's funny. I got to live that a little bit. My dad playing it in Atlanta, and that was like just when people were starting to get satellite dishes and stuff, and we didn't have one right when we got there. And it was the same thing. It's Atlanta. They're not putting hockey on. It was football, baseball. It's exactly. You'd have to bring our whole team in to go watch a game.
And the other thing was, if you if you did find a satellite dish, you could find it because they were about the size of Sputnik. They were just massive. I had a couple of them, and that I don't think made my neighbors very happy because they just took up so much room. It wasn't
your neighbors. How about your wife?
Yeah, well, she knew what was going to go on there. That I was going to find a way to watch a hockey game somehow. Yeah. And then they broke all the time too. Like not only did you have to spend all this money on a big C dish, they were called. They were these massive, huge things. They looked like you were trying to talk to Sputnik, and but you also had to have a technician who knew how to fix it at close hand because they were always breaking down.
Yeah, and I think we all went through that cycle of having one too. I mean, we long before the pie plates that we've and now heck, we don't even need that. It's all on the internet. We don't need anything like that anymore. It's crazy. So my original question was try to compare a Stanley Cup final in the 80s and 82 to say 2011. I mean, and the enormity of it. Which to me, off the top of my head, 2011 was much bigger than 1982.
Yeah, and 94. It was huge. It got, and it is today, and good for the league, good for hockey that it is important enough now that it is a huge deal. 82 was big in Vancouver. I don't even know how big it was on Long Island, but 82 when they came home from beating Chicago, and then we're going to play the Islanders. The city was nuts, and it was simply fantastic to be around. There was media coverage, but there weren't as many outlets, so it wasn't overwhelming. It did get a heck of a lot busier for the coaches had to do a little more, but it was for me 82 once you got to the Stanley Cup final was still fairly routine. 2011 was anything but. I mean, there was by that time in 2011 they had a huge chartered jet to fly all the media, broadcasters, writers from Boston to Vancouver and Vancouver to Boston. There were, 2 planes for each team because the families were going. And then, the press box was jammed. There were so many requests for the players that it was almost impossible to get near anyone. And that's one of the years too that, as we were talking about earlier, that because they had to control things, there was less access. They just had to, it was kind of simmer down everybody because you can't have the sit-ins every game and you can't do an interview with Zdeno Chara every game. Give them some space. And I understand that because it was a whole new world of broadcasting and writing.
You've got to do some really cool stuff through your career. Obviously the Stanley Cup finals, but I was at the Canucks Autism Network tournament, and you were kind of on the panel the first night, and I got to hear you talk about the Olympics and how that's your favorite memory of your broadcasting career. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why it's at the top of a list that, would 15 different events would have been other people's number ones?
Just simply because it's best on best. And we just don't see enough of that. Certainly haven't seen enough of that in quite some time. But part of the reason that I really love the Olympics, especially 2014 in Sochi, was because that team is the best team flat out I've ever seen play the game. They give up 3 goals in an Olympic tournament, and Carey Price's save percentage was darn near 1,000. And there was never a moment of time during any of the games that they played where I thought they might get beat here. They were that good. And even when it was close, you just kind of felt that they were such a lockdown team that it was great. It was too bad the events of that Olympics made it sparsely attended. And that was the bad thing. The good thing was, because there were so few people there, you could go anywhere around once you had a pass and you could get into into the area where all the venues were, there was nobody around. You could pop in and watch just about anything. And then the arena was seldom full. I don't even think they sold out the Olympic hockey final. But no, it still was the Olympics, and it was a great event because it was best on best. And in particular in hockey, on the women's side and on the men's side, the teams were so good that it was really an honor to be there watching them and calling the games. And you knew at that time, I knew that no matter what, in the middle of the night back in Canada, there were people watching, and lots of people watching. And that was cool too. You know that the eyes of the country are on the game that you're calling.
That's really cool.
So was that your only gold medal game, Olympic gold medal game?
Yeah, I was in Turin.
So you became a victim, like a generation of these players, that a victim of not going to the Olympics for 18 and 22.
Right, and then so there were. I worked for the team. I worked for the group that didn't have the rights in 2010.
That's right. Yeah,
that was. Yeah. So I was a fan for that one. I went in. I had been to the Olympics in 2006, but Bob and Harry were calling all the big games. I got one Canada game there, and it was terribly disappointing because they lost to Switzerland 2-0, and it was an awful game. And it turned out to be a lousy Olympics for Canada at that one.
Was that Martin Gerber doing his job? Was that who was the Swiss goalie? I think it might have been. It might have been.
I was working with the late Greg Millen, and we got the second venue, which was just an auditorium that had been converted to an arena for the Olympics. And it was ice cold because they had to make it so cold to make ice in this building that wasn't ever built for a hockey game. And they had this makeshift scaffolding press box where our head was touching the roof of the building, and it was not a terrific experience. Unlike Sochi, which had a beautiful building and great accommodations with nobody in them, it was kind of the opposite.
Your memories of doing Canuck games, are there games that stand out when, whether it was a West Coast Express or before that? People complain out here, and they're certainly complaining now, I can tell you, that, the team is really bad. I said, the game is so cyclical in that sense that you really admire a team like Detroit making the playoffs for as long as they did. And I think from about, so right around 2000 until the Sedins finished at 2012, there was a dozen years there where it was extremely entertaining out here. They didn't win the Stanley Cup, but boy, when the West Coast Express were around, and when they finally caught up to the Colorado Avalanche and could play them head-to-head and even, they were rock stars. And it was a time when most of the NHL was emulating Lou and the Devils and were locking down every game. And we were lucky on the West Coast to watch a team that wanted to score. Bertuzzi, Naslin, Morrison, fantastic line to watch. Matthias Olin on the back end, Ed Jovanovski. They were an extremely entertaining team. So those are fun days, and they won. Most of the time they won, and that leads to a lot of fun for everybody because when you're touring with an organization, everybody's really upbeat. And I thought that before that, when they moved into the new building, there was every reason to think it was going to be just such a good team, and because they had such good players. Trevor Linden was still the captain. Bure, McGillney, who else was there? Matthias Olin was still there. Brett Hedican, Adrian Aucoin. They had Kirk McLean in goal still, but it never worked. And forever, it's a complete and a wonderful lesson in team that, you can have the best players in the world, but if you can't play like a team, you can't win. And that team should have been
should have been one of the best teams in the league for about 4 or 5 years. And instead, they went through coaches, they went through general managers, then they hired Keenan, and every player went out the door. And it just, then they had to start all over again. So I understand why when Mike came in here, he had to make some moves, because that's why they brought him in. This team wasn't working the way it was supposed to. So it's an interesting study in the game of hockey and the game of team, because we've seen lesser teams or lesser groups of good players excel and be fantastic, where you can't just throw all the best players on the ice and think you're going to win anything.
On the same line as John's question there, you had a long career, and you were talking earlier about, you got to have relationships with players and other media and all of it. Do you have a story or a couple stories of something like funny stuff at the rink or travel from back in the day that are kind of your go-tos?
Oh, travel was ridiculous because it was all commercial. Mm-hmm. I wasn't there, but I always point out to people, the Edmonton Oilers won 4 or 5 Stanley Cups while traveling on DC-9s with smoking sections everywhere. And it always blew me away that would happen. I don't know. I remember the most interesting incident that I was part of early in my career was I was in Quebec City doing the game for Robson the night that the Canucks went into the stands, and Harry Neal got suspended for 10 games. Roger Nielsen took over as coach, and the next thing you know, Roger's staying on in the playoffs, and they're going to the Stanley Cup final. But I always look back on that and think, if that ever happened today, they wouldn't just get a 10-game suspension. They might get 10 years in jail for doing what happened that night. But it was a time in the game when there were a million fights all the time. And the Canucks had their share of toughness. Tiger Williams played on the team. Everybody had to have a certain degree of toughness. And I still remember Tiger Williams fighting Peter Stastny. And that's probably what really got everybody in the building angry, and the Nordiques as well, because that should have been a terrible mismatch. But I don't even remember the fight. I just remember them coming up the glass and getting closer and closer to where the benches were. And the whole group in this brawl had moved to the glass where a fan could reach over, and some guy ran down and tried to get at Tiger Williams, and Harry went nuts, and over he comes. And the next thing you know, here's Mark Crawford, Doug Hallward, and who else? Crawford and Kurt Fraser. And I could just imagine being a fan and having Kurt Fraser come over the boards with an angry look on his face and his fist cocked. I'd have been out of there so fast, but it was pretty wild what happened that night. But it's amazing how it pulled the team together. And, they went on to, I think they won every game when Harry was out. So they couldn't put him back in behind the bench. And Roger took over. And it was a day, too, where you had 2 coaches. It was, right. It was Roger Nielsen and Ron Smith. And there was no video coach. Roger was the video coach. It was a pretty interesting time. But there more than minutes and moments and games in those days. I just remember a lot of the characters there, and there were a lot of them. Stan Smeel was a great captain and just still probably the most revered player in the history of the team, and great guys, and had so much fun when Stan became a coach, and he and Glenn Hanlon were the coaches, the assistant coaches for Pat Quinn, and then they stayed around for Rick Lee, and they stayed around for Tom Rennie, and then they stayed around for the next coach as well, for Mike Keenan. And the stories we would tell to each other when we got together about all of the crazy things that were happening. And I mentioned before about those years where there were such good players, but there was such turmoil in the organization, and nobody knew they knew who the owner was, but they didn't know who was really running the team. And The other bizarre, maybe the most bizarre day I've ever had was, it was early November. I think it was November the 4th, 1997. Pat Quinn was a general manager and Tom Rennie was the coach. And Pat he decided to quit coaching, but he was always around the team. And he let Ricky Lee coach for a bit, and that didn't work out. And he hired Tom Rennie. The Canucks were not having a very good start to the season. And they had, I know Pat had reluctantly signed Mark Messier. He didn't think his team was ready for that. And kind of ownership did it. And so now things weren't working out very well at all. But I think that happened a little later. But so the Canucks aren't playing very well. And Pat's on the trip, which as a general manager, he wasn't always there. But in this particular time, because the team was not playing particularly well, he was around. And then everybody started whispering about Stan McCammon coming to town. And he was John McCaw's right-hand man. John McCaw was the owner. Stan McCammon was his right-hand man. And so people knew something's up here. Something's going on. So Stan McCammon at the morning skate, way out in Landover, Maryland, at the old Cap Center, where you couldn't get a cab, you couldn't rent a car, and you barely find a hotel to stay in. On that morning, I got to the rink and then realized from somebody on the team that Stan McCammon had joined the team and was firing Pat Quinn. But that was happening back in the hotel, and the team was at the rink, and I was trying to run back and forth, trying to figure out exactly what's going on. I had to get onto no cells, so I had to get onto a payphone that barely worked, and I went live onto the 8 a.m. news in Vancouver to announce that Pat Quinn had been relieved of his job, and we weren't sure who was going to take over, and weren't sure what was going on. And then I got a hold of Tommy Larscheid, who was the color commentator, and he was back at the hotel, so he was able to go and interview Pat, so that we could use this interview on our pregame show before Pat packed up and left. I mean, he's been fired, so he just left the hotel, and the team once again was in disarray. And so then we go to another road trip not long after that, and I'm in the hotel in San Jose when I find out that the next move is that Tom Rennie and his staff have been fired, and they got wind of the fact that Mike Keenan was coming in to take over. So I sat in the hotel room with Tom and his assistant coach, Terry Bangan, and in the middle of it all, there's still Glenn Hanlon and Stan Smeal, the assistant coaches. They're hanging around. They don't know what's going to go on with them. They don't know anything about Mike Keenan. I knew him, so I gave them a little heads up that chaos is on its way to town, and things aren't going to be the same. And I just remember one of the first things when he got there and he took over the team, and he really didn't know the team and he didn't know the guys. There were two guys, and I still laugh about this to this day. Dave Scatchard was a center iceman. Lonnie Bahanas was a diminutive forward who ended up playing in Toronto, and I think Keenan got rid of both of them, but he really couldn't figure out their names, and he was on the bench. And the guys were telling me after that every time they were up, he'd be calling down the bench, "Boho, boho," or "Scratch, scratch." And they got new nicknames that stuck with them forever. Anyway, that's a really long-winded answer about a few things that went on there, but it was there were some pretty funny times.
Oh, that's awesome.
Well, and you're right about chaos coming to town.
You think about the next year. So as soon as Mike was allowed to be the acting general manager, then things really started to get chaotic because who was gone? Trevor Linden was gone. Gino Ojic was gone. Mike Sillinger was gone. Grant Ledyard was gone. Martin Jelena was gone. And he just and Kirk McLean was gone. He just cleaned house, and he had carte blanche to do it. And as I said before, yes, they were chaotic times, but he had the mandate from ownership to make the changes because they just spent a whole bunch of money on a whole bunch of guys, and for 2 years they've been floundering.
I still remember that when he took over the job, I was running Hockey Night at the time. And so he phoned and says, "John, I've got a job. I'm going to Vancouver. I'm coaching in Vancouver." I said, and I think I'm going to be the manager too, because that's when Steve Tambellini was still around a little bit doing half the job. And I said, "Hey, do me a favor. Will you wear a microphone for us for your first practice?" "Oh yeah, sure, no problem." So next thing you know, he comes in San Jose. He comes into the rink. Not only does he have an entourage of media, but he's got a cameraman following him everywhere too, wearing a microphone. So people, what has happened? What is coming to town with the Vancouver Canucks and Iron Mike Keenan? So we laugh about it to this day.
Oh yeah, it was chaotic but fun. He was a fun guy. One of the other things that he did almost immediately is he couldn't believe the hotels the team was staying in. So we went one night. We flew into Tampa, and we went to this. I don't know. It was not a very nice hotel. It was downtown, and it was before downtown Tampa had really been looked after and redeveloped and built up a bit. And we all went to our rooms. And then about 5 minutes after everybody got to their rooms, the phone calls started coming. We're leaving. Get your stuff. We're getting out of here." And he had a bus outside the hotel, and everybody got on it, and we went out to the most palatial, beautiful hotel by the ocean in St. Petersburg, and we were there for a couple of days. I had never thought that I would go to New York and stay in the Essex Hotel on Central Park. That's where we stayed when Mike was the coach.
Well, you got to know, this was after he coached the Rangers, and the Rangers did things first class, and Mike would never. Once you were first class with the Rangers, you were first class everywhere around the National Hockey League.
Yeah,
that's funny. That's funny. Hey, so before we let you go, we've actually, you've given us more time than I imagined, but. What do you tell young play-by-play guys? What do you tell them now? I mean, the game
Get
has
a real
changed,
job. I'm almost serious about that, because it's so difficult now. I mean, it used to be, and what I would tell people all the time is, be prepared to go somewhere. Be prepared to go to Medicine Hat, go to Swift Current, go to a Western League town, wherever you can get a job. Be prepared to go and give up what you're doing right now and immerse yourself in it, and go to work for a radio station. Now the radio stations don't exist. The junior teams and the training grounds are all they're all televised, because I think that's the packages that the teams put together, and to make sure that all of their players, parents, and families can watch them. But you better be prepared to work for free. There's so many of the junior teams that all of their, not so much in the Western League and maybe the Ontario League, but a lot of, the places where I started out, for example, in the BC Hockey League, if you wanted to go there and work now, you better be prepared to work for very little money, be prepared to have more jobs than one, because they'll probably want you to be the entire PR department, the play-by-play man. And, if you want to be a color commentator, you better be able to do that for free. So it's not a very nice picture to paint for someone who's young and really wants to get into the business. So you really have to try hard, and you really have to be dedicated, and you probably have to have another job, or at least somebody who can back you in order to make a decent living at it. It's so it's not a cut and dried question the way it used to be. It used to be dedicate yourself, go somewhere and learn.
Jimmy, thanks for this. Appreciate the time on a Friday.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you both.
Jim Hughson, Hockey Hall of Famer, member of the BC Hockey Hall of Fame as well. and former voice of the Vancouver Canucks, and obviously, as people remember, one of the great voices of Hockey Night in Canada. Landon and I'll be back after this on 100% Canucks.
All right, listen up. Today I want to talk about giving 110%. Giving 100% means giving everything you got. Giving 110% means giving 10% more than is humanly possible. If we're going to win as a team, we need 100% of you guys giving 110% 100% of the time. If only 50% of you guys give 110% and 50% of you guys give 100%, I guarantee you 100%, we'd only win 50% of our games. Suppose 75% of the 110% gave only 50%, and 50% of the 100% gave 25%, and 75% of the 110% were not feeling 100%, then we'd be in a heap of trouble. That's why we need 100% of you guys giving 110% 100% of the time. Okay. Let's go out and play some hockey.
So, Len, did you learn anything there? Just that, you know, it was a little more chaos in the 80s and 90s than it was.
Yeah, a little bit. It sounds just a little bit different from the reality we live in today and how it all works. But, you know, it's funny, you know, before he came on in our open there, you brought up, you know, Robson and Hughson and Shorthouse. Mm-hmm. And now that we've completed the trifecta of Canucks calls, you know, there is something, you know, you said that they all have a style, and to me, it's a lot of cadence. But the other thing that I noticed thinking back at the other two and now listening to him is like the passion for it, but like the respect that they had for the players in the game and how important the job was to them. It comes through so easily listening to them talk about their time and you know, kind of remembering different stories.
Well, I was not going to tell Jim if he hadn't heard Jim Robson talk about it when Robson told us on the podcast that he felt Jim Hughson was the best hockey broadcaster of all time. But when you think, and there is something to it, like Robson's the original, Hughson carried on the legacy, and then John Shorthouse became the continuity of it. And they do have a little bit of their own, but there is a Vancouver style, and it is something that has existed now, well, a lot longer than 1970, because Robson started doing hockey in the late 50s, early 60s, but certainly in the National Hockey League since October of 1970, when the team joined the NHL. Thanks for this, Landon.
Yep, thanks a lot.
2 more shows next week on 100% Canucks. Thanks for listening or watching this edition, and we'll see you next week. 100% Canucks.